If Proverbs was said to be the palm oil by which words were eaten easily, what kinds of idioms continue to embody, mirror, and echo this power and ease to circulate knowledge and broker exchange? And in what ways can storytelling help us to see ourselves in renewed ways while welcoming us to think presently in and about the world and our place in it? I think it's quite powerful. I don't know about you, but I think it's wonderful. So to kickstart the conversations, we're going to be having a conversation with Ibrahim, Mahama, with our curator at large, Misla Lipsical, who is our curator for, as you've seen, for most of what we've got up today. So please welcome them. Oh, one other thing. On our side screens, we're going to have QR codes that will help to manage the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, you can scan that, and you can then input your questions. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Are you with me? We're so sorry that we've started late, but we're really excited to have this conversation. We were able to get Ibrahim Mahama, who is a very, very busy person, who's got lots of great and exciting projects coming up this year. But the reason why we invited him was because we certainly believe that what he's doing is extremely important and speaks to this idea of hope that Tokini was very clear about telling me would be important for the conversation. So we are going to begin. And if we have a few hiccups, please forgive us along the way. So before we get into the material, Ibrahim, I was looking at some of your material, and I realized that there's something about the way that you work which really resonates with me. This idea of remembering, of resurrecting. And I remember Uche Okeke talked about this idea of usable pasts. So before we get into it, I want to go back to an interview done in 1987 where one of our Ghanaian women luminaries who passed away this year, Amata Aidu, had a few things to speak about education, because education is central to his practice. But it also connects back to the exhibition that we have here with Bruce Onabrakpeya and his generation, who were really thinking about the kind of education that they received and what was actually lacking. So if I could get the video people to cue the video for us. Let's see. I guess this is that first bump that we've hit on the road.
The whole essence of what we are trying to do in Ghana now is to just give meaning to that statement of Nkrumah on the eve of our independence. Mm-hmm. People quote the others like the independence of Ghana is meaningless and so on. But there is something that he said about a new African who has come onto the scene now, ready to take on responsibilities and make decisions
for himself and herself.
That's right. And we have not prepared our people to do that, and we continue to
expect things. If education doesn't prepare anybody to take charge, to take responsibility for his or her own life, then it is no education. We used to, we know that Ghana pays so much towards education, and yet really it is like coughing money into his education.
What were your ideas?
Oh, well, basically it was to democratize, education and make it more nationalistic. Yeah, but nationalistic in terms of more African, more Ghanaian into education.
You have called yourself a critical patriot.
Have I?
Yes.
Where did I do that?
I've seen it in some interview with you.
I see. Yeah. And I think Ghanaians, nearly the whole nation is, are critical patriots, because we are highly politicized people. Ghanaians don't sit, people discuss, they talk, you know, I mean, all over.
So Ibrahim, you know, the reason why I wanted to use this as an introduction was that I wanted to hear from you about education and in particular to Black's Art Lines and what's been happening in Kumasi. So can you talk to us a little bit? And I mean, if you could use what Amatu was talking about as a segue.
Thank you very much. Hello? Hello? Yes. Thank you very much for having me. Tokini has been hunting me down, seriously, but I'm very happy to be here. I think that I just realized today that I've given the most talks in Lagos than any other place in the world. I think this is my 8th talk in the last 7 years. So it's always good to be back here. And I do acknowledge all like the really important artists and colleagues who are here. And Ms. Le, thank you very much for having me. When we went to the university, that was in, my undergrad was from 2006 to 2010. And at the time, before us, of course, when we went to school, there was a new generation of professors led by Caricature Seidu, who were very much interested in this idea of like using pedagogy as a way, radical pedagogy as a way of like, let's say, breeding a new group of artists, things like that. The educational system that we inherited in Ghana, like in Nigeria, was the old British curriculum, the Han and I. So there was very little room for imagination, like within the program, things like that over the decades. A lot of artists who were trained in it, of course, they went on to become great artists and all that. But within the period of caricature, he was more interested in how ideas around philosophy, also ideas around science, mathematics, the cosmos, failure as a point in itself, because Ghana, post-independence and even pre-independence era, there was a lot that happened. But when you look at artistic production and all that in terms of materiality and all that, a lot of that wasn't taken into account. But of course, if you're looking at that, our history in relation to, let's say, even the history of Nigeria. So for instance, when we were in school, Caricature's generation was one of the first that would introduce students to like Chico KK and others, like the Uli Aesthetics, Zaire Rebels. Before that, those were not even thought within the curriculum. So it was more or less a matter of finding artists, even not just from Ghana, but from around the world who were doing radical work. So in America, people like Robert Rauschenberg, of course, Yinka Shonibari himself is here. So when we were students, it was very important. It was like, hey, an artist can do this kind of work and the kind of thought that goes into it conceptually. Those were some of the things that were missing from the program. So Caricature as himself, who was a painter, he had to transform his practice from being a painter that made objects into into teaching in order to be able to inspire our generation as artists.
Yeah, we're going to have to do this as a tag team because one of our mics has died. And hopefully the projector is actually going to obey me when I try to get it to change. And that seems to not be working as well. Can we get some tech support as we keep going? Okay, so, there we go. No, still not working. Okay, so while we get that sorted out, we'll go ahead. You know, when I was doing research for the curatorial programming, one of the things that, I was trying to enter the dialogue from different points, and one of the things, especially because we brought the library here, was to think about art histories. And so we have Ruth Simbao, who's in South Africa, a great mind. I believe that she did a special issue for African Arts together with Black Art Lines. And she, raised a very important question. She asked, how do we unsettle old art histories? Because we know so much of the writing on Africa is actually coming from elsewhere. Thank you. Okay, great. Now we can do this a little bit easier. So can you tell us a little bit about the quiet revolution in the arts education? Because you talked about Karakuchi, and we're going to see a little bit of his presence in the work as well. How's that taking shape today?
Well, I can say that today you have a lot more artists who are doing a lot more experimental and radical work than it was before. I think in our generation, when we entered art school, the idea was to look outside for examples. So, for instance, in Senegal, a lot of like curators like Oluogwebe, Chika Okeke, Okwenwezo, Bisi Silva, because Bisi Silva also made a trip to Ghana when we were there as students. Ngoni Fo herself was there, worked with Nobuki extensively. Before, that connection wasn't really there. So the Quiet Revolution was also about, I think Caricature's generation was about finding the people outside who were like in solid, because we're looking for comrades, people who could somehow inspire our students, bringing them into the program somehow to inspire the coursework. Because if you're a student practicing in Nigeria or Ghana and you realize that, there is this ABC who are actually from the continent who are doing ABC, I think it goes a long way to inspire you. And for us, that was very significant as part of the Quiet Revolution. And it was mostly also towards just encouraging students to do independent practice and also experimentation. And they didn't need to succeed as it is in most art schools, because we have to train students, and whatever be the case, when they come out, they have to become a success. But you cannot measure success by the fact that maybe you have students who are selling works to collectors and things like that. It was more or less about the significance of the ideas that the students would come up with. And I think that's where Caricature's hopes were in.
When I was talking with Bruce on our Prakpea, one of the things that I wanted to understand was that, when they were thinking about the colonial curriculum, it was where they turned to. So, the exhibition in the corner over there, Writing With, deals with that. Which is also something, what I was interested with you, because I think that what we'll see through the presentation is really this idea of how an artist comes to their own materiality, how it becomes imbued with science, and then how that actually translates. So I'm excited that we'll be able to get into that. So I'm going to try this again. Okay, there we go. It's working now. It's just a little bit slow. Maybe I just need to get to the tech team. Can you help me get to the next slide? We keep seeing this over and over again. Okay, so maybe we're going to just do this without the slides until you guys can get... Okay, great. I'll do that. So can we go to the next slide? Oh, okay, perfect. The last time I saw you, you and me were both considerably much younger. This was in 2015 when we visited you at the Off-Cobb residency. And Hans Ulrich, who I was traveling together with, had a project about remembering writing. So he got you to do this little post-it on the right-hand side, and you wrote Kwame on it. Can you tell us a little bit about this post-it note and the graphic below it?
It was part of the residency of Cobb in an artist's house in Ibrahim in Ghana. And when Hans came, he likes this caricature thing, so he asked whether I could make a sketch for him. And at the time, of course, most of the work in Kumasi is also inspired by the work of Kwame Nkrumah. So I was thinking a lot about that in that time, and I made just a little note on it in relation to the materials I was working with at the time, because this is just after the Venice Biennial had opened in 2015 and had shown this jute sacks which was draping the Arsenale. So it was very fresh on my mind, and these are some of the sketches that came from that period.
Yeah, I showed this image on the right because I think it's going to connect to the visuals that we're going to see of Ibrahim's work at Venice. So could we just go to the next slide? We don't have to stay there too long, but as I said, a very young Ibrahim on the right-hand side, and this was an exhibition of his work that was happening at the time when I visited at the Museum of Science in Accra. One of the things that Hans Ulrich always asks are unrealized project. What was your unrealized project? And at that time, you said that your unrealized projects were the very strong political ones, working with spaces with significant history, failures, contradictions in space. So have you started to realize some of your unrealized projects? Or is the vision bigger than this?
Well, it's growing with time, yes. I guess when you see the slides, you realize that 10 years later, after the MFA, I went back to some of these ideas. But my mind is more filled with institutional building these days, and I think that's where the real political work needs to be done. So I think that I've stepped into it, but maybe it might take the next 50 years to realize.
I'm excited because from what you've shown us already, like the work that you've been doing is it's really inspiring. So can we go to the next slide? This is just a quick slide of us when we were together at the Ofcob residency, and let's go on to the next slide as well. So, as I said to you earlier, for me, as somebody who's like having research grounding the way that I work and thinking about where our histories actually lie, and making sure that we actually have access to those histories, I returned to an image of Ellen Atsui's father, which was taken in 1925. And for me, what this image really reflects is this idea that protest and the demand for dignity is something that's not going away for us. It's been something that's been there. And what this image is that it was taken in 1925 when the Prince of Wales was visiting the Gold Coast. And I think it's quite remarkable that Elle's father was making a protest in this fashion. And when we talk about writing, I use this idea of writing in an expansive way because I believe that it allows us to access all kinds of knowledges, like something that's embedded in textile, which I believe you use through your practice. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is an image of the installation in Venice, and I had asked you earlier if there's a specific name that appears on this textile, because I just noticed it, right?
Yeah, there are quite a number of names, including the Kwame, but it's also because a lot of these materials were originally made in India and Bangladesh, and after being brought to Ghana, they're used to transport cocoa. But when the cocoa leaves Ghana, the bag remains, and they use the bag for all kinds of other things. But I've always imagined that the bag begins to live after the cocoa leaves Ghana, because all the traders, they acquire it, they write their names on it, they cut it, they restitch it. So you really begin to see the prevailing conditions of the society within the material. And for me, that was very interesting to look at in terms of looking into the political content of the material in itself, and seeing how that opens up access and conversations around architecture, issues of the ghost within the parliament that I'm working on, and all the projects that came out of it.
Yeah, and for me, I think as Africans, as Black people that are constantly facing erasure, it's just really interesting to see that you're doing the exact opposite, which is bringing things out and making things visible. As you may know, and as I am sure our guests know, there's a booth here at the fair that's dealing with the Nigerian Imaginary. It's going to be the project that goes to Venice. And I thought it would be really important for you to share a little bit for us what this moment meant for you to be brought in the project that Okwi Enwezor did for the 56th Biennale. Because I don't know, maybe I'm guessing, but I feel like it was a linchpin, like a turning moment for you.
Yeah, it was. It was very brave on the part of Okwi to invite me to the biennial, because I remember I was a student in Kumasi. I was working on my MFA graduation show, and I got a message on Facebook that, "Oh, are you Ibrahim Mahama? Can you send a portfolio?" I thought it was a scam. I was like, I'm not responding to this message, So I didn't for a while, and then one day I was like, okay, whatever. So I responded to it, and then I had to send an email and a portfolio, and then I didn't hear from them. And 2 months later, I got an email that you've been invited to the Venice Biennial. We had a party in the university that day because our professor caricature had been teaching like documenta, blah, blah. Before that generation, none of that was almost part of the curriculum. So for him, it was almost a sign of relief that, he faced so much resistance when he wanted to teach in the university that he wanted his students to be part of the global art conversation. And the fact that one of his students had been invited to Venice, he thought that they were closer to something, And when I went to Venice, of course, I'd never been to Italy before, so I made a proposal, and the proposal was actually covering all these buildings. I was young and wild. I was like doing, putting the material everywhere. So in the end, when I realized that it was not going to be possible, and I needed to go there to negotiate, Okwi was very good because the space in the Arsenale, because the building is UNESCO protected, and most often they build walls within the space and they hang works, things like that. But the outside space that we, in the corderia, that space had never been used to show any work in the history of the biennial. But in order to do that, we needed to drill some things into the wall, and we couldn't, because the part of the biennial, the part that the biennial owns, is UNESCO protected, and the other part it belongs to the Navy, the Italian Navy, and that is also protected. So Okwi's team had to go out of their way to negotiate and to get a guy who could map out the entire space. They took a photograph of it, and it took a long time. So they mapped out, they got permission to drill. So it was really important, you know. So at the end, you know, Venice, they don't pay for the production of the work. And as a young student, I was like, how do I even get to produce this work? Because most of the work I had done in Ghana as a student, I had funded them independently by making drawings for people and others. So that was where the point was. I was thinking, how do I do that? So I had to make some works for some people, and with that money, I was able to produce the work and then ship it to Venice for the install. So it was a matter of meeting someone like Okwi, who was very supportive, but at the same time also me understanding that I was coming from a place like Kumasi, where caricature would say that you really have to take, like Amatedo in the video, where Nkrumah says that the black man is capable of managing his own affairs, where I'm like, okay, I know I'm young, but how can I put myself together in order to be able to do this very ambitious project?
It was, because I remember, I mean, I didn't have the pleasure of going, but I remember thinking, wow, this is a very significant project, because if I remember from the photographs, it was quite a long installation, very dramatic, you couldn't miss it.
Yes.
Just speaking a little bit further about that, what is the importance of showcasing at Venice? Like, can you just tell me about the power and the importance of such a platform for yourself?
Well, I think it was because of the depth of it also. I started working with White Cube at Venice. At the time, I remember that there were many galleries even before in London when I did the Gasworks residency back in 2013 and up until Venice in 2015. There were a lot of people that actually approached me about representation, things like that. But I guess at the time, I was more or less, I still had concerns about my work in terms of the ideas within the work, because I always wanted to stay true to the ideas as much as possible. So it was more or less, it took almost 2 years before we did the first show at White Cube. But certainly, I think that because of the platform of Venice, it somehow catapulted the work across the world. So yeah, it somehow opened up possibilities which maybe would have taken a lot longer, because I was quite very young, 26 at the time, you know. So for me, it also felt like a dream, but at the same time, I also knew that beyond Venice as a platform, we have to be able to focus on work that needs to be done on the continent. So after that, of course, I've shown in Venice 3 other times, and one with the Ghana Pavilion. And I always ask myself, how much money do Africans need to put together to go to Venice to spend on a biennial, when we can actually invest a significant amount of that money into building the necessary infrastructure for artists within the continent? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's like the perfect segue to get onto the project, which you have so many beautiful images of, which is the Parliament of Ghosts. And I want to start off the conversation just like with this statement that sounds so fantastic for me: transforming art from commodity to gift. I hope that we'll just work through some of the questions that you raised through this work, but at the end, it's like really about giving you the runway to really take us on a story and a journey of this project. One of the questions is it possible to imagine a future using death and decay as a starting point? I think, you know, across the African continent, we understand that there's so much upheaval, there's so much unrest, and this is something that has not gone away. And I think that, you know, the question of where does hope come from when we're constantly facing these problematics is something really, really important. But what I find really fascinating is that you're not running away from failure. Actually, you have gone straight to the heart of it. And you're thinking about how that can actually be a force and produce some kind of dynamism. So let us do what we have come here to do.
Yeah, thank you. Can we have
The next
slide available? Yeah. So, yeah, it's a bit blurry, but I guess we'll work with it. So this, I wanted to start with this image. So this is, there's a show that I'm working on in Scotland next year. And I wanted to go back to my practice as a student making drawings. I used to make a lot of paintings and charcoal drawings when I was a student. And of course, caricature himself has been one of the major inspiration within our generation. He's a very big mentor to all of us. And I was really thinking about this question of what he meant actually to us in our generation and how that has helped us to be able to connect to, let's say, distant histories and all that. For instance, in relation to like the British colonial history, before that, in relation to our generation and the generation that would come after us. So as you rightfully said about art transforming from a state of commodity into a gift, it was always about how we could take the things that already existed and somehow transform them, give them this state of transformation that could change the way that we see the world around us. Can we have the next image?
I'm going to apologize now for Ibrahim because he gave us such heavy, precise data that we really sort of struggled. So this is not showing the work in the best light, but actually, you know, what we're really here to do more than anything else is just hear him talk.
Can you go to the slide before? Yeah, they're really downgraded. Yeah, but I guess you can see the images. So this is a file. It's a documentary on how the the port, the Takoradi Harbour, was built in the early 20th century. And at the time when the British needed to build it, they built it because they needed to get cocoa, gold, bauxite, and others in the Gold Coast across. So they spent almost 2 decades building the port in relation to the railway network. And a lot of the people that built the railway, the labor, actually came from the northern part of Ghana. So you even realize that there are some of the men who are almost half naked within the image and all that. And for me as a student, it was always coming back down to that question again. How do we go back in our history and how do we reclaim these failures and other things? Because the government has this habit of constantly, oh, something is old, why don't we sell it to scrap dealers? So they create a consortium, they sell it among themselves, and they sell it to the Indians and the Chinese. So as a student, because I was doing a lot of the projects at the railway, and the question was, how do we go back into these histories, and how do we take the materials there and then transform that into like a gift? So this image is where, like in Tamale at Red Clay, we got some of the old railway lines that had been built more than a century ago, which were going to be scrapped with all the, I believe that they are, like, it has witnessed so much in history. And then using that to build a line within this space that another generation can somehow experience it from a more transformative point of view.
Can I ask a question? Because I think there's 2 things that I find really fascinating and really important. One is interdisciplinary practice, and the second is research. Yeah. And you know, who actually owns or has our knowledge and our archives? And I feel like, could you talk a little bit about that when you talk about the images on the left, like who owns these photographs, where did you get these photographs, and your work to recuperate this knowledge?
Yeah, I think this is part of the British Film Archive. I saw it on Instagram actually, and I just made screenshots of it because I thought it was interesting, because up until the time when I was working on this project, a lot of the images were more theoretical in my head because I knew the history existed but had never seen moving images of it. So one day a friend of mine sent me a link, one of the curators in Ghana, Kwesi Oheniaye. So I looked and I was like, wow, like this is what I knew but I'd never seen it before. So I took screenshots of it just to be able to use it for presentations for our students in Ghana. But we have to own it in different ways. So sometimes I travel to some of these archives and then I go through the archives and I get permissions to use them for publications and other things.
Yeah. Shall we go to the next slide?
Yes. Yeah, and I think one of the most important thing was also this question of excavation, because the idea of like when you're doing some kind of an archaeological exercise, for me, archaeology is not so much about the past, but it's also so much more about the future. When we took the rail lines and we brought them to Tamale, and we had to rebuild them because I was thinking about all these memories within them. So as part of it, each time we're working, because our institution focuses a lot on school kids, we have to bring, we always, Tokini was talking about that, how you bring school kids to the art fair in order to be able to see artworks and other things. That was very primary to the work that we're doing, the redistribution of the work. So when we bring them, the idea is for them to witness the building of the history that we're talking about. Because in 20, 30 years' time, a lot of these kids are going to become the future leaders and all that. And I always complain that in Ghana, even with all the work that I do, it's almost impossible to, I can't even get access to drinking water at our institution. Or even the Minister of Culture, who is from the region, will never visit the institution. So how do we, if we're making work as artists, how do we ensure that at least there is a generation that understands the work, the precarity and everything that it comes with, the building of it, into the future. So one day when they inherit it, at least they understand they were there when, like, it's like a caricature always said that we have to practice curating from the bolt and knot, going back to the substructure of things. So for me, it's very important in terms of how they witness these elements. Yeah.
You know what I think is kind of really beautiful and fascinating is that in almost every single picture you're going to see children. You know, as a curator, when I think about art, I love art. I'm committed to art. You know, that's why I do this. But I don't necessarily always think that art, or the way at least that we see it today, is it's generous. And I think it's kind of really incredible that you have claimed art as ours, and that you are making it visible and possible for young people from the get-go to be experiencing it, to be understanding it, to be using it as a tool to see themselves in time, to see themselves in history, and for it not to just simply be something aesthetic, but something actually powerful and a language for them.
No, it's very important. Can we go to the next image, the next slide?
It's almost like painting, painting.
So it's quite interesting also because with the rail lines, it's interesting that we can have we can use it as a playground. So something that has that sense of density in terms of history, suddenly via bringing a transporter. And mind you, we had to transport this almost 700 kilometers from Accra to the north in order to build this line. And there had never been a railway line in this place. But the labor that built the line but in the Gold Coast was actually from this place. So for me, it was a form of restitution and also some kind of reparations through the institution in a way, because as an artist, when your work converts into capital, what does that capital represent, or what does it mean? So for me, all those things are represented within the image. Can we go to the next slide?
And this is a working railway, right?
Yes.
A working railway that somehow the government has resisted making possible, but that you've actually made possible.
It wasn't meant to be, because a lot of the tracks were actually sold to scrap dealers. They were meant to be melted into steel, iron rods, but I had to save them in order for this to happen. But the point is that in the north, we have a lot of white missionaries there. And also, they always come there with their kids. And in Accra, people would always say that, but Ibrahim's work is only possible in the north because they are villagers and they've never seen a train line before. They've never seen this kind of infrastructure, because there are all these videos circulating on social media where people say that, we had some kids coming from the north and for the first time they saw like a proper building in their life, because in the north it's very impoverished. But it's not true. It's absolute nonsense, because even when the expatriates and the whites come there with their children, they're equally very excited about it, because it's not as if in Europe you can go to a train line and start running around and playing. It doesn't exist, because when something falls into a state of crisis, it really changes how you can perceive it and how you can use it. And moreover, we as artists or cultural practitioners, we have a different way of seeing the world, because we want to take crisis, or we want to take a void and we want to open it up and we want to delve deeper into it. So for me, I'm very much interested in how we build things and how collectively in the world we can all experience it, whether we're Nigerian, Ghanaian, or American, or any other. Yeah.
Can I ask you, how did you have the epiphany that you could go from crisis to play? It's not the most intuitive one.
Well, there's a lot of play in crisis. Yeah, in Nigeria is the best example. There's so much comedy in this country amidst all the tension and the crisis. So I'm like, anytime I travel anywhere in the world and I'm nostalgic of food, I look for a Nigerian restaurant. And anytime I'm bored, I look for, I subscribe to all the Nigerian comedy skits. Because, they take sometimes the most dense things and they make, they make very simple, humorous things out of it. So for me, I think it's very, it's very interesting in that way. Yeah, Nigeria is a very big inspiration. Not to say that, but it's also about the sensitivity that it comes with. Because, of course, when the NSAS and other things came, you realize how much some of these guys were also leading the protests and all that. So it's not as if they're irresponsible, they're just making fun. You also have to pay attention to where the humor comes from. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, and a lot of the trains had been cut into pieces, into scraps. So I had to, after buying them, I had to trace the people who had cut them into scraps, the contractors, and we had to pay them because they had the memory of where they had cut all the pieces from to pay them to weld all the trains back together again. So it's more like a sculpture now because it's almost like an artist that is building, but it was actually coming from a real historical material. So they're now putting it together. Can we go to the next slide? And then looking at it in relation to the historical images, like in the early 20th century when a lot of these machines, because the trains actually were pure representation of like colonial extraction and all that, because it's not as if they brought trains for people to sit in them for fun or anything. They purposely had one purpose. So can we go to the next image? So in Tamale, when we built the rail line, the question was also again about the crisis and the failure. How again do we go back to this? Because a train without an engine, again, how do you activate a train? Something as massive, it's 80 tons, like 80,000 kilos. Yeah, how do you activate that? So we invite members of the communities, schools, and then we physically activate the train by this way, by manual labor. Also revisiting the image in the beginning.
So it's kind of like using the body.
Yes, exactly.
And through the hard work or the labor, you actually understand the process.
Exactly. Can we go to the next image? So that's where the Parliament of Ghosts also becomes important because when I was working at the railway and doing the research over time also, I was looking at the materials within that, and I always ask myself, how do we use these materials in order to be able to make artworks that we can use? This is one of the infrastructure. It's called the Locomotive Workshop. It's in Sekondi, a part in the coast of Ghana. And it was built in the early 20th century together with the railway infrastructure and all that. It was actually meant to repair the railway infrastructure, but these days when you go there, a lot of it has been somehow derelict and all that. So I've been going there for the last 8 years, collecting materials for my work. So I conceived a work for the Whitworth in Manchester, which was titled The Parliament of Ghosts. So if you go to the next image, the next slide.
While we're waiting for oh, there we go.
Yeah, so this was the first iteration of the parliament. But you can imagine a lot of the cabinets that you see in the room are some of the cabinets that were made in the early 20th century in the workshops and others. And the seats are actually coming from the old German locomotives, German trains, coaches that were also used in Ghana and all that. So for me, it was also a matter of taking these historical materials which have been destroyed and using that to build, let's say, an amphitheater or a platform that could allow for a new way of thinking or a new way of collective experience.
Yeah, I mean, and when I see this image, I'm really thinking about ghosts. How do we recall ideas and bring them back and give them form? And also this idea of material. How does an artist find their material? And I just find it really impressive how you've been finding your material through these objects and items from daily life that you've been retrieving. Can you tell us a little bit about how you source these items?
Well, sometimes when you're driving through the city or the country, you find that there are materials or objects packed by the roadside or in places, especially when it comes to wood, because a lot of the old wood from the cabinets and others, they were selling them to the women that cook in the market. So they were using them as firewood. And I always said, come on, you cannot sell this as firewood. They're very historical materials. And they said, oh, but can't you see termites have eaten into part of the wood? And I said, that's the real intent, you know. So they said, what do you want it for? And I said, well, I'm building an institution in Tamale. It's like a museum. But like, but in a museum, what do you need termite for? And I said, it's not a Western institution, because in the West, if they see one termite in the museum, they shut it down. But in Africa, we live with termites, you know, so I'm like, you cannot pretend that you are living in this, you're living on a continent. So for me, the idea was first and foremost to consider the significance of the material. So we've done it to a point now that people write me on Facebook, on Instagram, like, oh, my mother died and she had all this old furniture. We're thinking about getting rid of it. I'm like, okay, just bring it to our institution. So we organize a van, we go, we pick it up. We're like, okay, how do we compensate you? They're like, okay, we don't want money, we want this. So it's always been a matter of negotiating for these objects.
I say this because I believe it was last week when I was together with Professor Bruce Onobrakpe, and he was telling me that one of the most important things as an artist is that the ability to see.
Yes.
You know, one has to go out into their world and see. And so what I see through this is you going out into your world and seeing what is the material, the substance that is animating your work.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's very important. I think in the next couple of images, it becomes a bit more clearer. So there is a movie called Interstellar. I don't know how many of you have ever seen that. It's like a post-apocalyptic film. The end of the world, they sent some scientists to find a new world, a planet for mankind. And the scientist, the engineer who leads them, the astronaut, he realizes that in the end, before they left Earth, he was sent a message through his daughter's room that he said there was a ghost. And he needed to go and find this place. And he realized in the end of the movie that he was always the one that sent the message to himself. So it was like a time loop. An idea that his distant self was always connected to his past self. So the idea that a ghost can somehow transcend boundaries and it's not something that is stuck in a specific place and moment in time. Can we go to the next images? The one controlling the slides, can you spend like 15 seconds on every slide and just skip it? Yeah. So from Whitworth, coming back to Ghana, we had to build a parliament. So excavating the ground and building the parliament as a permanent architectural form. So we had to transform the work from a work that was existing in a museum into an architectural piece. Can we go to the next image? Yeah. So I hope those of you at the back see the image more clearer. Yeah, but this is the relationship between the parliament in Manchester, where the museum is there and then the work is constructed within it, versus building the work in real time, where actually we can experience, let's say, the production process and all that. Can we go to the next space? Yeah. So documentation is also very important to me. For instance, tracing how something is built and how we experience it as it's being built, as I spoke about. So I made a lot of documentation of it. Can we go to the next image? So looking at the very different forms and how it transforms, and the points that at every point in time, any of these spaces could have been the space. So this, I think this was in the peak of COVID. We had school kids in the community when it got really hot coming to swim in it because of the architecture. It would gather water, and that was the same water we'd use to mix the concrete for the building of the space. So even the kids in the community would just come there, sit, because they play around. It's like going to a community where there are abandoned sites, and the kids play around within those spaces. So again, I was very much interested in how that precarity can inform, again, like combining the collage of historical materials of the arrival of the trains in relation to like school kids visiting the projects, because it's almost as if in building, the kids are like our commissioners. They've commissioned us to build something, you know, because most often when you hear architects talk, they're always talking about clients, and the client said this and that. But I also like the idea that you are building because you imagine a future, and the future is actually based on, for instance, this younger generation in terms of what that means in another timeline. So we have very different ways of actually engaging and using the space, and I've always imagined that the idea of the ghost is like a kind of occupation that takes very different forms. Ecological forms, animals are engaging with it. So the parliament is not necessarily just for human beings, for you and I to sit in it. The idea of just occupying it with an ecological system in itself also is very important. So this is one of the tours that we give, where school kids, we just invite them to give them tours of the construction process, where they talk to the bricklayers and the construction workers, because all these things are actually part of the experience of art. Art is not just going to see work hanging on the wall, but the idea that we can open up the underlying questions within artistic experience. Can we stay here for just a few seconds more? So this is quite an important image, because where a group of schools had applied to use the space, because they do that all the time, for workshop. But it was the time that we were building the floor. And they were using the space, the floor, whilst the bricklayers were building the floor at the same time, whilst there was another group of school kids who were there to actually witness, to look at the collection, the parliament, and everything that we had at the institution. So for me, it's also the question again about what art is with regards to its experience. Because at the end of the day, you cannot quantify it in terms of a single image, because it comes from multiple different perspectives also in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I really see the idea of welcome, and I think you probably elaborate a little bit more for us, but the idea that the work that might exist within the museum also exists within the local, and is part of the institution that you've built in Ghana. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit about that, because it's about the artists having some kind of control about their own legacy.
Well, I think it's very important, because if you're looking at, for instance, one of the things that I was always concerned about as an artist was always about artists' works disappearing from the continent. Because for myself, like growing up, I studied the work of Bruce, L, and others, but I can't count the number of times maybe I've seen the work of, even as a Ghanaian, as an artist, I can count the number of times I've seen the work of L. So then again, I always wondered what happens when we produce work within any given environment. How do people within those spaces, where the crisis that inform the choice of materials and the politics of the work, again, when the work becomes an object, a commodity, what does it become? So for me, the question was always that if an artist is able, for instance, to take, like, let's say the jute sack, which contains, let's say, cocoa as a commodity. The cocoa, when it's sold in Europe, Switzerland, and other places, between Ghana, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast, that produces some of the highest cocoa in the world, we don't even get up to 5% of the general revenue from cocoa. But even that money, you always wonder what it becomes. So the empty sack, which is discarded, which is cut, and others, when it becomes art, it has even a much more powerful transformative tool. It's like, again, the ghost. The ghost is even more potent than living. So the cocoa, which was once inherent within the bag, that's lesser than the bag which is now destroyed. So I always imagine that how do we even go further to somehow go into this context of using the residues of capital in order to be able to build, let's say, transformative works that allow for a generation to be able to experience these works in real time. I think in a different generation, it did happen, like within the generation of Bruce and others, but steadily, you've seen a big decline again in it. Of course, now it's rising again through projects like this, and also through artists investing into building like studios and other spaces. But I think that is something that we need to pay attention to more.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite fascinating how you've dealt with this whole idea of extraction, like actually resisting extraction, but also really giving us a really great example of what patronage actually looks like.
Yeah. So, as they're going through the slides, you'll see like the very different constellations. Can we go in the next slide? So a lot of these objects are, so sometimes you almost try to pretend and imagine that you're a time traveler. Because when you go back in the past, a lot of these objects would have been discarded and everything. So I go around the country and the city and I collect objects and I produce works with them. And these works are, a lot of these works, I don't produce them for exhibitions. I produce them just for myself and for the institution. So when I make a work as an artist, first and foremost, I think, how are people here going to experience this work?
So is this, are we seeing a little bit of the experimental aspect of your practice?
Yes, okay. Exactly, yeah. So it's unfortunate a lot of the images have been heavily downgraded, so the quality is quite bad. But you won't be able to see it quite well. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, here you would have seen, it's very crystal clear. We're making these tattoos.
Tattoos, you said, yes.
Yeah, onto like the old leather of the trains, out of the carbon of the, the lanterns and all that. Can you go to the next slide? I think the next slide is quite interesting. Yeah. So can we stay here just 1 second? So these are historical materials like pots, terracotta.
For water.
For water, storing water in the villages and all that. And again, archaeology is very important because, again, we're talking about restitution and things like that. And for me, it has always, a lot of these traditions are fading away. So also, this kind of intervention where, for instance, when you go to the villages, the women these days, they like to use these huge plastic barrels and other things like that. And there's nothing you can do about that. So it was also a matter of how to facilitate and negotiate that, where we give them materials or containers that they want, and then we take the old containers and we preserve them, because we're building these new archaeological sites also around the institution and also reinterpreting them from a contemporary point of view. Yeah. Think we can.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I find also interesting about this is how you are recovering pasts, pasts that have been like, I mean, technologies like you were saying about the water preservation system that suits the location, is healthy and produces life, right? But has been discarded because of modernity, where people are using things like plastic.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's also, for instance, this next series of images, it's also just the idea of a play of material. Because again, when you go to the rural areas, you find that they use straw, clay, and others to build. And the idea of red clay actually was inspired, the name was inspired by Yusuf Indo. He has this album, From Village to Town, and in it he has a song titled Red Clay. And the lyrics is like, red clay on the road, searching for his soul. It's like, yeah, you're searching for your soul within the soil. So within the architecture, because I was thinking about ways in which we could somehow defragment architecture, and somehow they could become characters within this kind of contemporary context that we're dealing with. So go to the next image. Just go through the images. So the idea of playing with these materials, straw, and then playing with them in very different forms within the context of the parliament. I think the idea of these images within the parliament was not so much about, again, like the idea of transforming art from a state of commodity. Because a lot of these works, I imagine that within Western context, a lot of these works would not be possible. So, for instance, this particular work was when we built market spaces within the parliament. And there is a man here, he's in his late 60s. He's a bricklayer. So he's been the one with his team building the institution since 2015. And it's interesting because how does the labor, the laborers and everything that goes around into the building of the institution, they are somehow actors also within the institution. So if you go to the next image, you realize that sometimes some images disappear. Okay, maybe go to the next image. Okay, so in this, you can realize that this is the same man that I'm talking about, Mr. Dogolo. So for me, it's very important that we somehow do not annihilate labor from the way we interpret and the way we read art. Because sometimes even when we have school kids coming to the institution, some of these guys are the ones who take them through the institution. They talk to them about the work, reinterpretation. I remember we did an exhibition where we had a work of Olafur Eliasson within it. And for me, it was very interesting to see how our security man was doing tours every day of more than 200 school kids, where he was interpreting the work of an Icelandic artist through his own perspective. But again, language also plays a very important role, because in Africa, education is fast deteriorating. So sometimes we have the school kids come into our institution, and even when you say the man, you have to explain what the man is. So language became very important, that sometimes we have to find people even within the communities who can use the local language as a way to somehow deconstruct contemporary art as it is. Because if we're going to rely on, the fact that you're just an artist and you're doing work, but people say, I did the work, the people don't understand the work. And I'm like, is it you that did not understand how to, for instance, redistribute the work? And the redistribution, that is where the political form is within contemporary art production within the time that we live in.
So I think we're running out of time.
Yes.
We're going to turn over to you guys, and hopefully the conversation has sparked lots of questions. You can use the QR code, which is on the side screens. I guess it's going to come back on, so that you can submit your questions, and we'll have a few questions before we wrap up and go to the next talk. I hope we have time for that.
Yeah, this time.
Okay, we do.
We're under time.
Okay. No, we have a few questions. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to ask you this question. Chimamanda Adichie says, telling a single story causes incompleteness. Do you think there's any incompleteness in telling stories of contemporary art in Africa?
Yeah, of course. I think it's. I think one of the things that contemporary arts did was somehow to open up, to introduce the multiplicity of voices and also perspective, because a lot of modern art, to quite an extent, did not do much of that, you know. And I think that in late modernity and also those were some of the questions that were being raised and all that. But I think that primarily within our generation also, and also like the generation that we inherited art from, the question was how do we expand that, the questions that arise from art, regardless of wherever it is coming from. So I think it's one of the most important things.
Absolutely. And the next question comes from somebody who's equally interested in education. They say, education and art, how has one impacted the other? And considering the state of education in Nigeria, can art transform the landscape?
I think art certainly does. I think art inherently is supposed to be transformative. I guess sometimes we just get carried away by it because of the fact that it mostly appears in the state of an object, and we want to dwell so much on the aesthetics and others. But I think that there is so much power within it. And there are so many people that have done a lot of incredible work, particularly when it comes to education. Fall is an example here also. So I think that education always has this power of transformation within the way that we read the world and the way that... So I remember Caricature always said that if he would have imagined that if every single young person in Ghana had studied a bit of philosophy in school, in terms of even politics and everything, the kind of transformation that would have come within our society would have been much more greater than we've seen today. So certainly it's, the transformation level is unimaginable. Yeah.
And we have another question. What do you believe is the duty or the role for museums in Africa? Maybe we'll start with that.
Well, I guess, from my point of view, I guess it has always been to find ways to redistribute different sensibilities and all that. I don't think that the role of a museum is just there to preserve. There is no point in preservation if it cannot be redistributed, if it cannot be accounted for, if people cannot interpret it in their own language, in their own way. There were some of the images that were in the last that we didn't show, but it also showed ways in which, like for instance, you have the chuk-chuk drivers in Tamale and others, and they're always the ones that actually go out of their way to bring people to the institution, because each time they take people and they're like, oh, where are you from? They're like, oh, we're from Accra. The first question they ask them, have you been to the Red Clay studio or whatever? So because more often when they come there, they actually feel that they are part of the fabric of the institution. And I always made a joke that when you go to, for instance, I always use Tate as an example, because each time you go there, majority of the security people working there are black people, and 99% of the audience are white. That's when you always hear people say, oh, but the people in the Bronx don't want to go to MoMA or things like that. I'm like, why do you think they don't want to go to MoMA, you know? There are inherent questions within what a museum should do, particularly within the 21st century. And I think that our reading generally of what a museum does till date is still quite very limited. So I think that museums still have to find a way to expand the context of what a museum is as they are running it in order to be able to accommodate these forms.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this idea of the gift that your institution in Ghana does not actually charge a fee, but that has produced some sort of like hesitation or resistance from the local government. Could you just explain a little bit about what that is?
Well, it's I don't. It's
well, maybe
difficult
the
to
idea of
understand
gift, right? I mean, it's such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, I understand that clearly, but it's difficult to understand how they don't see the point of what it is, because I think most often on the continent we somehow misunderstand culture, the production of culture for tourism. So in Ghana we have the Ministry for Arts, Culture and Tourism. and they always want to quantify everything with regards to money. But you cannot quantify culture when it comes to money. Culture is culture. When artists produce works and they produce intellectual ideas, culture, and everything, maybe one day some of these works go into museums and then people go and they pay money and they see it, whatever. But inherently, if I'm producing a work or an institution, building an institution as an artistic form, and I want to open it up to people, you cannot tell me that people have to pay in order to be able to experience it. But like, oh, but what about the white people? They can also pay to experience. I'm like, fundamentally, when we're experiencing culture around the world, it has to be the same. I cannot be taking money from. It's not as if when the white people pay and they see it, it changes anything from the locals. It's the same lens. We want people to see things around the world around the same lens and develop perspectives out of it. So for me, I'm finding it quite difficult to understand why that there is. But you also understand that as long as we resist it, and then we work to an extent where another generation comes up, because it's not in our lifetime. 50 years from now, I strongly believe that there will be a different generation that somehow their relationship to culture will certainly be different from what we have now. For now, we are just the guinea pigs, I believe.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what's inspiring is that despite a context or a condition that's unwelcoming, let's say from the government side, is that the people have embraced it. Like you said, even like the Chocho driver, where people are, pointing to the institution and what it does for them. I think we must have some artists in the room, because I have a question that sounds like it's somebody who's an artist. Just a second.
Okay.
Maybe it got deleted. I think the person was asking, do you ever have blockages where you can't think of any ideas? How do you deal with creative blockage?
Well, for me, the only thing I do is to think. I'm always thinking about ideas. So at home, I'm always working. I'm hyper-productive. But at the same time, sometimes I don't work, because it's also because we travel quite a lot. You have to travel to teach somewhere. There is a talk to do somewhere. There's a research you have to go and do somewhere. So there are moments of gaps, like half of the year, where you are not physically producing anything. But then when I finally come to the studio and have to produce anything, sometimes it's in between having to produce, because most of the exhibitions that I do around the world is mostly institution specific. So every exhibition that I do changes. So sometimes maybe you're making a drawing, another time you're making a sculpture, another time you're making a very different work. So it's always very difficult to catch up with your own thinking. But for me, I think that's where the challenge is. It's quite exciting that you have to somehow unsettle your own thinking all the time, because you always have to start from ground zero. Tomorrow you wake up and you're like, maybe I could rethink about the position that I had to these materials and everything. I think that's the beauty and exciting thing about art, because at the end of the day, again, as I said, most of the work that I've done till now, 90% of them are in Ghana. So it's not so much about producing work to sell. It's about producing work that you feel excited about and you think that it means something from the ideas. And when people come and you share those ideas with them and they're excited, I remember recently we did on TV something. I gave an interview, and a woman called and said that, my daughter was going to school and she wanted to study visual arts, and I did everything not to let her study visual arts. And now I listen to an artist talk about art and I have so much regrets, because I imagined that art could have been anything, and I just imagined that she was just going to do drawing, and what is so exciting about drawing. But to think about the idea that to think about the complexity of art, even if just an artist was doing drawing, to think that people don't think, for instance, if I'm looking at Bruce's symbols and everything, like, but the artist just woke up one day and just did. I'm like, are you sure about it? A lot goes into art in terms of the thinking. So I think that's the gap, that people think that artists don't think enough. And then now we're saying that, but that's all we do. We actually think. It's just that the form that comes out might be very simplistic, and that's the point of it, because everybody has to be able to share within the simplicity of the form.
So on that note, Ibrahim, I'd just like to say thank you for making time to be here today with us. Thank you for welcoming us to think together with you. We're really excited about what you're doing, and we're looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you.